Hello, I'm Ben Wattenberg. Subpoenas are flying around the White House and the Clintons are in hot water over Whitewater. Meanwhile, the Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, is under investigation by a special counsel. Are these real scandals or just the product of a scandal machine in Washington? Joining us to sort through the conflict and the consensus are Suzanne, resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and author of Scandal, The Culture of Mistrust in American Politics. Michael Beschloss, author of The Crisis Years, Kennedy and Khrushchev. Robert Lichter, president of the Center for Media and Public Affairs and author of Good Intentions Make Bad News, Why Americans Hate Campaign Journalism. And Larry Sabato, professor of government at the University of Virginia and author of Dirty Little Secrets, The Persistence of Corruption in American Politics. The topic before this House, the American Scandal Machine. This week on Think Tank. Scandals are nothing new in Washington. Some have been real and some have not been real. The last 30 years have seen Bobby Baker, Chappaquiddick, Tom Eagleton, Spiro Agnew, Watergate, Burt Lance, Billy Carter, Abscam, Senate Pages, WedTech, Jim Wright, Gary Hart, Iran-Contra, Michael Deaver, Clarence Thomas, and Anita Hill.
I, William Jefferson Clinton.
Since Bill Clinton was elected president, similar sorts of scandals, some real and some not real, have beset his administration. Here's a short list. Whitewater, Travelgate, Webb Hubbell, Vince Foster, David Watkins, Paula Jones, Ron Brown, Roger Altman, Castle Grande, and legal records that have disappeared and reappeared. But are there really more scandals today than ever before? Or are scandals no worse than in the past? Or have we just created a giant scandal-making machine that is hell-bent on finding dirt, even if there isn't much to find? Suzanne Garment, your book lays out a thesis of what has been going on. Why don't you drive this bus for us?
Okay. The incidence of scandal is not the same as the incidence of corruption. You can have a lot of corruption, very successful corruption, and no scandal because nobody finds out about it. But the incidence of scandal has risen in the past 30 years because over that time, opinion leaders have grown less trusting of government. One result is that we consider more things scandalous, and the other result is that we've developed much more elaborate means than we used to have for finding out about misdeeds and publicizing them and punishing them.
For example, what are some of those new instrumentalities?
For instance, we didn't have an independent counsel before Watergate. Now, today we have one. We have inspectors general that report not to their administrative chiefs alone, but to Congress directly as well. Within the agencies, we have officers that serve the same function. We have a press that's more investigative than it used to be. Public interest groups devoted often precisely to exposing wrongdoing in their fields of interest. And a lot of players who have an interest in showing us as much as possible.
Let's get some comments. Bob Lichter?
Well, I'd like to pick up on one element of that, which is the more aggressive press that you talked about. A couple of things have changed. First is journalism has changed. Journalists are willing to probe into areas like sexual misbehavior that they used to turn a blind eye to. And the media have changed as well, not just the way journalism is practiced, but now you have all sorts of competing media outlets. You used to have an oligarchy of the prestige press, the networks. Basically, what the New York Times and CBS said was news, and that was it. All news is fit to print. Now, they try to ignore something. You've got all of the inside editions and hard copies and the Washington Times, the New York Post, that are willing to carry these stories and force them out where the mainstream media eventually has to cover them.
Two papers that syndicate my column. Larry Sabato, right?
Well, the press has changed. I agree entirely with what Bob and Susie have said, but the people have also changed. The American people, over the course of the last 35 to 40 years, have become enormously more cynical, They are also more interested in private life. The line between public life and private life has dissolved, and not just because press coverage has grown more intense, but also because people are more interested in that. And I think the coverage reflects what people are interested in, and that relates to the number and kinds of scandals that are covered.
Michael Beschloss, you are a distinguished historian. Why don't you give us a take looking back?
Well, I think this is all true, and I think there is a historical reason for it, and that is that 30 or 40 years ago, and before that through American history, it used to be the case that, for instance, a president would be nominated in convention by a process dominated by party leaders. Those people would vet a potential president, and usually when there was someone with financial scandal in his past or another kind of vulnerability, that person was not likely to be nominated. That process is no longer here. There's not a party to do this vetting. Now that falls to the American press and the American people. It has to be done all out in the open. One other thing that I think has developed, has really changed things, is that before roughly 30 or 40 years ago, it used to be the case that it was very rare that someone would be nominated for president without having been a national figure for a pretty long time, a governor of New York or some other major figure of prominence. Now that you have a situation where a Jimmy Carter, a Bill Clinton can come in, win the New Hampshire primary, be nominated very quickly by people who 90 days ago or 6 months ago had never heard of him, that means that there is a process by which we have to find out things about these people that we otherwise would have known had they been in public life for 30 or 40 years.
So does that mean that the American people are really getting the wrong story, that they believe, because of all these factors that you have talked about, that there is more corruption and more scandal than there actually is? Is that?
No, it's a question of balance and proportion, Ben. All of these stories, and I don't know whether Susie agrees with this, but I think all of the stories have some merit to them, or at least the vast majority do. There's some grain of truth in most of these controversies, but it's a question of balance and proportion. Do you really get a picture of the whole person, the whole candidate, when the news media coverage focuses so completely sometimes on the negative aspects and the scandals that have dogged a candidate in the past?
They go into what you have called the feeding frenzy mode.
They go into the feeding frenzy mode. They focus almost entirely on the negative motives and the vices. And these people are very complicated human beings. They have virtues writ large and vices writ large to match. And it's wrong, as the press did 40 years ago, to focus just on the virtues, but it's equally wrong to focus just on the vices.
I just want to make the point that, although God forbid that I should defend the press, it isn't as if there's this rogue media out there that is stampeding and destroying the whole system. Michael's point was very important, which is that political careers are made through the media much more than they used to be. And so there is this system that has worked out that people in the press are fed rumors and fed scandals by opponents of politicians, and whereas a generation ago they would have reveled in knowing this gossip and being the only ones to know it, now they gain professional status by being the one to break the story. And so there's a system of incentives that's built in. I mean, this is a way, in effect, for a politician to get a free negative ad running against an opponent.
That dovetails exactly with the structural point that Susie was making. There are all these additional sources and infrastructures that are designed to just churn out scandal, and that sort of plays right into what you were talking about.
Yeah, when you have a media-driven system and a media that is driven by entertainment values, I mean, scandal is almost a natural to burble up in public discourse.
And of course, many of these sources are political consultants. You know, let's be direct about it. They're a permanent part of the system. They're the permanent sources for the press. And of course, they're involved in dozens of major campaigns in a given year, and over the course of their careers, probably in hundreds of campaigns. And they're supplying a lot of this gossip. They know how to play the press like a fiddle.
Let me ask a question. Until fairly recently, there was a point of view that said because the major media was tilted to the left, most of the scandals revealed were on the right. Now, of course, you have the whole phenomenon of the Clinton situation. Was that valid then? Is it valid now?
I think it's really hard to say that there have been, at least through recent history, the period during which these scandals have really become something of an industry that it's either more left or right. And I think the thing, and this threads through everything that we've been talking about, now since there is this structure that does ferret these things out, I think it would be very hard to confine it to one side or the other for ideological reasons.
Also, there's this great imitative capacity of American politics. After Watergate, Democrats did take this morals issue up with great enthusiasm and used it against officials in the Reagan administration with great frequency, but it was really not very long at all before Republicans, Newt Gingrich especially, figured out how to turn it around.
Larry, let me ask you something. I know you have looked at the current situation with the eye of a scholar. You investigated this the Clintons situation. We are hearing, well, even if it's true, there's nothing there. How do you come out on that? Is there a there?
Which scandals are you referring to, Ben?
I don't.
There's a telling question.
I don't have to say. You tell me. I mean, is there a there anywhere?
On Whitewater, the jury's out, and I can't tell you. We're going to have to depend on the independent counsel for that. As far as women are concerned, I don't think that anyone who's taken a close look at President Clinton's past in Arkansas could conclude otherwise than that many women were very close to the governor of Arkansas, who's our president right now. Whether it should matter is another question entirely, and you can debate that endlessly. But I'll tell you one thing, it's going to be very difficult for conservatives after the Clinton administration is over to say that the press just harps on the scandals of the right, because the Clinton administration has had many high points, but it's also been a long series of scandals, and you enumerated some of them, and there are others beyond those. There are an awful lot of scandals connected to the Clinton administration, and I don't think the press has held back particularly on most of them. They may have gone too far on certain aspects of Whitewater, for example.
How did it come to be that at the same time that there was allegedly and probably realistically a sexual revolution in the United States, where people are a lot looser about these kind of things, that at exactly that time the microscope started going in on politicians and saying, ooh, shame on you, you did an XYZ. That seems to be a contradiction.
What happened is that sex became politicized, and you had forces from both the left and the right, you know, traditional forces that were very much against the sexual revolution and the looser sexual behavior, and were scandalized to find political leaders behaving this way. And you had feminists who were scandalized not by sex but by a patriarchy in which men got away with this kind of thing. So there are political interests feeding into this machine. And this is something that I want to really push when you talk about the media going after the right or the left or whatever. A lot of it is this is happening in an era of divided government, and in which you have hearings in which news is being made, in which one party can gin up the scandal machine and give reporters a chance.
The Democratic Congress went after Nixon. Now you have the Republican Congress going after Clinton. One gets the feeling that is not an accident. That it is not just that they, in either case, that they have, oh my God, just uncovered a terrible crime. I mean, there is a lot of straight hardball politics going on. I
think one thing that can be said is that in recent years, politics has to some extent become criminalized, so that you get in a situation where if you want to make war against a political opponent or set of opponents, one way of doing it is investigating very fiercely and hoping that something will either become a scandal or something that becomes grounds for, to put it in the most extreme way, impeachment.
And there's another contrary trend that takes place. There's been a kind of great inflation in this area.
Absolutely.
If there's nothing to indict for, these days we tend to say, oh well, then it's okay. Because we're used to indictment being the natural end of each of these scandals.
There's a book out called Primary Colors that is a novel, apparently by an anonymous author, apparently based not so loosely on the Clinton primary campaigns in 1992, and it paints a portrait of the president-to-be, then governor of a small southern state, unnamed in the book, who has gargantuan appetites, let us say, in everything. This is now the topic du jour among Washington players. There's another book, I think, coming out about President Clinton by David Brock, who is a pretty hard hitter on these kind of things. And I think there's one other, at least one other. Is all this going to set up another round of who is this man?
Well, I'm not sure that's the question that will be asked, but it will certainly.
What's the question?
It will. Well, the question will be, what is this man's private character, and how does it relate to his public character? You can be absolutely certain that between now and November, probably in September and October, there will be a new round of character questions about President Clinton. It is absolutely inevitable, and I think you're right to focus on primary colors. It may be a novel, but it is very thinly disguised. It is clearly President Clinton. Governor Stanton is clearly President Clinton, and frankly, I don't think it paints a very favorable picture of President Clinton. Whoever that author is, I understand why he or she went anonymous, particularly if it's somebody in the Clinton entourage.
Though, authentically feels your pain. I mean, there is sort of a good side to that portrait. I read it. It's a very interesting book. It's a lot of fun to read. But
there's a good side to it, but there's also a lot of compulsive sexuality, and clearly there are character problems attached to this particular individual. Very serious character problems that will be a subject for discussion. Maybe it's right, maybe it's wrong, but it's going to happen.
And I think maybe Bill Clinton particularly vulnerable to this because in early 1992, when he was running in the New Hampshire primary, two of the first things that Americans learned about him were Jennifer Flowers and the draft business. That was very early in the curve. If this had been Hubert Humphrey running in 1968 and something like this had come out, no grounds for it, by the way, but if something damaging had, he would have been someone who had been in national life for 20 years. People would have factored that into everything else they knew. And as a result, I think you can say that although Bill Clinton was elected president in 1992, it wasn't because he had solved this character issue. It was because he ran on the premise that perhaps I'm not traditionally everything that one looks for in a potential president, but I'm tougher than George Bush and I can deal with domestic problems that he's ignored much better.
Let me ask you another question. I listened to you here, and it kind of it's rancid, isn't it? I mean, this whole, not you all, but
thanks a lot.
No, that's okay.
I've been called worse.
No. I mean, is this demeaning and hurting American politics? I mean, I think most of you would feel, as I do, that beyond this, American politicians in some ways get a bum deal. They're trying hard. They're patriots. They do what they think is right most of the time. Blah blah blah, and yet this rotten, rancid portrait comes out. Is this bad for America? Is it good for America?
I think it's horrible but necessary, because as long as we've got a system in which, at least on the presidential level, presidents are nominated in public primaries as opposed to in conventions with a lot of influence by party leaders, someone is going to have to vet these people. And unfortunately, because the parties have given up that responsibility, it has to be done out in public in this sort of free-for-all, also by the press. If that is not done, especially because presidents now can get nominated in a very short period of time, you could find someone on the railroad track to a nomination who later on we find out has links to certain secret groups that we wouldn't want to see, certain very bad financial scandal that will shadow his or her administration. So in a way, as distasteful as this process is, and as much as it keeps many good people from wanting to go through it, I think there's no other solution unless you change the system to what it used to be, which in many ways I'd very much prefer.
I agree with what Michael said. It's also true, though, that character matters fundamentally, particularly in the presidency. And while there are excesses in coverage, and I've criticized them, and Bob has, and Susie has, and so on, while we criticize them, it's also important to note that they do serve a function. It is important for people to understand the character of people who are running for president. They have to.
Some of the worst damage that's done to the system by this new tendency is not done at the presidential level at all. It's done at lower levels of government, where the justification for knowing about character is less strong. So that personnel directors in the White House, for instance, ever since Watergate, have had more trouble than they ever did getting people into government.
That's a good area. Is this whole situation driving good people out of government?
I can't imagine why anybody would want to subject themselves to this. I mean, I really can't imagine. When Colin Powell said no, I thought, why would somebody like that ever consider sleazing themselves up unless they absolutely had to? Does it leave only the people who are driven by a desperate need for power?
Suppose somebody asked you to be president. Would you say no?
Knowing what, if somebody said, I can guarantee, the way with Charlton Heston and Ben Hur, they said, just get in the chariot and I guarantee you'll win. I'd say no, because I'd know how old I would look in 4 years from how old everybody else has.
President Sabato, does that sound nice? Would you run for office?
Yes, and I was going to say, the reason why Bob won't run is, of course, because of all the scandals in his background. We don't want to talk about
gotcha,
this here.
right.
Yeah, no.
But you're clean,
No, I don't think there are very many people who would refuse the office were it handed on a silver platter. You didn't have to run. But
would you go through the process if you thought you had a good chance of winning?
There are very few sane people who would undergo this process, jump over all those barriers and obstacles put in the way. I mean, it takes a very special person, and that's important for us to remember too when we look at the field of presidential candidates. These are not normal people. Very few normal people would run. These are people of enormous appetites in lots of different ways. Appetites of power and ambition and maybe personal habits of which we might not approve. Nonetheless, they're special people, and you need to weigh their vices and virtues. You have to do that, and I don't think we're doing that enough.
President Beschloss, does that sound nice to you? Would you run for office if somebody said?
I think I would not, for a lot of reasons. I think probably the world maybe needs a few historians, so I'll stay with that. But one thing that was said.
Sorry.
Another program, Ben.
Right.
One thing, not a bad bellwether. John Kennedy the Younger was asked, I think it was last year, how his father would fare in this new process with certain, needless to say, vulnerabilities in his background and so on. He said that in this new system, he's quite sure that his father probably would not have run for president. And whether that's good or bad, I think you're now in 1996 seeing a lot of people who might have run under the old system just completely out of the process.
President Garment, let's wrap it up with you. Would you, given this situation, would you run for office?
Me? Are you kidding? Of course not. No one can make it sure enough to promise to you that you won't get totally ruined by it.
There is really a very tragic aspect to the Clinton situation now. I mean, her 3 closest colleagues in the law, one has committed suicide, one is in the slammer, and Kennedy went back to Arkansas in some kind of disgrace, and she's in the ditch as well. So I mean, you really have, and a lot of their friends, pretty ugly.
And you wouldn't have called her a prime candidate for this kind of thing.
And you might say, if the two of them, the Clintons, had been shown in 1992 what was going to befall them during the next 4 years, you wonder whether they would have made the decision and actually had him run for president.
That
would have run.
That is a good topic perhaps for another program. Thank you, Suzanne Garment, Michael Beschloss, Robert Lichter, and Larry Sabato. And thank you. Please remember there is still time to enter our contest for the best political bumper sticker. Here's how. First, submit as many entries as you want for or against the likely Democratic nominee, President Bill Clinton. Second, submit your entries before the end of the first week in February. The winning entries will be announced on Think Tank and awarded a prize. Later, we will have a similar contest for the Republican nominee. So please send your bumper stickers and any other comments or questions to New River Media, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Suite 1050, Washington, D.C. 20036, or we can be reached via email at thinktv@aol.com or on the World Wide Web at www.thinktank.com. For Think Tank, I'm Ben Wattenberg.
This has been a production of BJW Incorporated in association with New River Media, which are solely responsible for its content.